Hello and welcome. My name is Malancha Chakrabarty and I'm here to talk about my paper India and CLMV countries, investment and development cooperation linkages. Now, let me just start by saying that the ASEAN countries have been a very important region for India for a long time, and the Look East policy had been upgraded to the Act East policy, keeping in mind the need for India to develop closer relationships with its eastern countries. Within the region, 4 countries, namely Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar and Vietnam, have become particularly important for India in the last few years for a variety of reasons. Firstly, these countries are very close to India's northeastern states, and the geographical proximity makes it very important for India to develop closer economic relationship with them. Secondly, geopolitically, these are very important countries. Lastly, these countries have also been very important because they've experienced high rates of growth, macroeconomic stability, and have become important destinations for investment. Therefore, for Indian companies to go and invest in these countries and become a part of the value chain is very lucrative, because it will not only help them access the benefits that ASEAN provides them, but also be able to access other markets like China and even Europe and the United States. So it was adequately recognized by the government of India that developing closer economic ties with CLMV countries is of utmost importance, and a variety of initiatives have been undertaken in recent years. For instance, the India CLMV Business Conclave has been introduced. We are also collaborating with them under the Mekong Ganga Cooperation Initiative. But the most important initiative is the Project Development Fund, which was announced a couple of years back, with a corpus of about 500 crores within the Ministry of Commerce, and the nodal agency is the Exim Bank, to encourage Indian companies to make investments in the CLMV countries. This is a particularly important initiative and highlights the importance that the Government of India attaches to this region. I'm going to talk more about this in a little bit of time, but let me just first introduce the current status of India's investment and development cooperation links with the CLMV countries before I go into the Project Development Fund. Now, I've already mentioned that this region is extremely important for us, and for a host of reasons, the Government of India has also been willing to facilitate Indian companies wanting to invest in the region. But what we find is that while investments from India have grown in recent years, India still ranks 27th in terms as an investor in many of these countries, particularly in Vietnam, and within the larger portfolio, we find that other countries like China, Japan and Korea are way ahead of us. So Vietnam has been the largest recipient of Indian investments, followed by Myanmar, then Cambodia and Laos. In Vietnam, there are about 20 large Indian companies like the Tatas, Marico Industries, Shapoorji Pallonji, the Adani Green Group, which have made important investments in Vietnam. Not all of them have been very successful, particularly the instance of Tata Steel pulling out of Vietnam was a very disappointing incident, but most of these investments have been successful. In Myanmar, the portfolio is very dominated by energy. So again, it's SR Oil and ONGC which take the lead. In Cambodia, most of the investments have been in the automotive sector, and in Laos, most of the investments have been in the plantation and the mining sector. With regard to development cooperation, it's important that we try and understand that there are 3 main pillars of India's development cooperation. First is ITEC, which was started way back in 1964 and continues to be a very important element of India's development cooperation. Then comes lines of credit, which at this point of time is the most important instrument of development cooperation, and India has extended concessional lines of credit worth millions of dollars to these 4 countries. Lastly, grants. Now, what we find is that ITEC has a relatively good record in CLMV countries, and during my interactions with Vietnamese scholars, in my interviews with many of the scholars at the Ho Chi Minh Academy and the Diplomatic Academy of Vietnam, as well as the Academy of Social Sciences in Vietnam, I found that most of the Vietnamese scholars were very receptive of India's capacity building and technological upgradation initiatives under the ITEC program, and they welcomed all these initiatives. With regard to lines of credit, which happens to be the main instrument of our development cooperation, there wasn't a lot of positive energy from the Vietnamese side for two main reasons. Firstly, the Vietnamese scholars sort of suggested that the public debt to GDP ratio was a key constraint for them. So Vietnam was not very willing to take on more debt, which already stands at about 64%, and there is a ceiling of around 65%. And most of these countries also, because of their proximity to China, have access to a lot of finance. So Indian lines of credit do not happen to be very attractive because they find the interest rate to be very high. And unfortunately, what I learned during my interaction with Vietnamese scholars was that India's track record in terms of implementation of infrastructure projects was not something which is very attractive to them. So while many lines of credit have been extended and further negotiations are taking place, it is not a very positive story from their side. Lastly, with regard to grants, there is a huge grant of around $40 million which has been given for digital connectivity in the region. But what we find is that within the grants and the lines of credit, what has worked very well in the CLMV countries are the quick impact projects. Quick impact projects, or the QIPs, are very small projects, something like building a school or a hospital somewhere, and maybe an agricultural college. So these are small projects, and these projects are very welcome because they have a very short gestation lag. So it's easy to implement them, finish them quickly, and then transfer it to the recipient countries, which is why it has been very successful. So that is a lesson learned. Now, that's the story from the investment and the development cooperation side. Now let's come back to the Project Development Fund, which was initiated with the objective of facilitating Indian investments in the region. There we find that the Exim Bank has identified about 5 projects in these 4 countries. One project of setting up a multi-speciality hospital in Cambodia, then another hospital in Myanmar, and an educational institute in Myanmar, and a pharmaceutical manufacturing company in Vietnam. So these 5 projects have been identified by the Exim Bank as of now for detailed preparation of DPRs, etc. But what is interesting is that, as I've mentioned, that the idea behind setting up of the Project Development Fund was to help Indian businesses, particularly manufacturing units and particularly textile units in Vietnam and other CLMV countries, because we felt the need to become a part of the global value chain, and that's how much of the global production and trade is happening. But if we look at what we are doing now in terms of what the Project Development Fund is trying to do now, we see that most of the attention is being focused into services, health and education. So this seems to be slightly off track from what was initially conceived, although investment in the services sector is very welcome, because that's an area where India has an edge over other countries. But I think ignoring the manufacturing sector is not the right thing to do, particularly in the context of the fact that India's textile sector, which really wanted to integrate with the regional value chain, is suffering from global competition, from regional competition, and some of the other countries like Bangladesh and Vietnam have literally gone ahead of us from the curve. In fact, another thing that I observed in Vietnam was that most of the scholars felt that India's efforts to push for greater cooperation in textiles is not a very good idea, because we do not seem to be having an edge in that sector, because we typically fail to meet the tight deadlines. Our quality is not deemed to be up to the mark. On the contrary, some of the other sectors which they suggested were the renewables, which again is very important in Vietnam. Then in the marine sector, in agriculture, in agribusiness. So these were some of the sectors which were identified by the Vietnamese scholars. And indeed, we should keep in mind the objectives and the priorities of the recipient countries to be able to make successful investments in those countries. So what are the final takeaways from my research? I found that most of the investment has been concentrated in the energy sector, particularly in Myanmar, and most of the Indian investors in these countries are literally the large top 10 big Indian companies. So these are not the smaller and medium scale enterprises. These are the big companies which do not really need hand-holding from the government. So the initial objective of trying to sort of help Indian companies make their investments through the Project Development Fund does not seem to be working as well. And in some sense, during my consultations within India, as well as the stakeholder conversation that we had here, it was felt that somewhere down the line the Indian companies, apart from the top 10, the smaller ones are not really aware of the opportunities that lie in CLMV countries, and some are risk averse, and many of them prefer to focus on the Indian market because it's so huge and it already has so many opportunities to make, vis-a-vis trying out a new market like the CLMV country. So these are some of my observations. I have found that there is a dominance of large companies. It is typically the top 10 large Indian companies which are able to venture out and invest in the CLMV countries, and many of them are public sector enterprises which have focused on the energy sector. This is particularly true of Myanmar. And the other thing that came out during my interaction with Indian scholars, as well as the stakeholder consultation that I held, was that apart from the big Indian companies, the smaller Indian companies are typically risk averse. They prefer to focus on the Indian market, which is huge, and also are completely unaware of the opportunities that exist in CLMV countries right in our neighborhood, as well as the government initiatives and incentives to invest in the region. For my recommendations, please log on to ORF Online, and there's a link below to my paper. Thank you.